January 1944, somewhere in the Central Pacific. The gunfire has stopped, but the silence feels more dangerous than the battle. Smoke drifts low across shattered palm trees. The sand is darkened by oil, ash, and blood. A young Japanese infantryman crouches behind a crater, his rifle empty, his unit gone. He has been taught since induction that this moment must never come. Capture is disgrace. Surrender is annihilation of the self. He waits for the end. American voices approach sharp, unfamiliar, carrying across the ruined shoreline. He expects the rifle butt, the blade, the revenge he has been warned about since training camp. He remembers lectures that described Americans as cruel, rashly hateful, incapable of mercy. Prison, he was told, would mean torture, starvation, execution. Instead, hands pull him to his feet. A canteen is pressed into his grip. A cigarette follows. Someone speaks slowly, gesturing for him to drink. The soldier does not understand the words, only the contradiction. This is not what he was prepared for. As he is led away from the battlefield alive, fed, and unstruck, the foundations of everything he believed about the enemy begin to fracture. And that fracture will widen with every passing day of captivity, leading into a world he was never meant to see. Long before any Japanese soldier encountered an American guard or tasted Allied rations, his expectations of captivity had already been shaped carefully, deliberately, and relentlessly. By the late 1930s, the Imperial Japanese Army was not merely a fighting force. It was an ideological instrument of the state. Military service was framed as a spiritual duty, rooted in loyalty to the emperor and reinforced through a strict interpretation of martial honor. Surrender was not a tactical option. It was a moral collapse. Field manuals made this explicit. Soldiers were instructed that to be captured alive was worse than death, not only for themselves, but for their families at home. This belief system did not arise in isolation. It was reinforced daily through training, ritual, and punishment. Recruits were subjected to harsh discipline, often physical, designed to erase individuality and replace it with obedience. Survival under extreme hardship was normalized. Compassion was not emphasized, endurance was. The treatment of prisoners taken by Japanese forces during the war in China and later across Southeast Asia reflected this worldview. Enemy soldiers who surrendered were often viewed as having forfeited honor. As a result, they were frequently denied basic rights, subjected to forced labor, and exposed to starvation and disease. These practices were not always formally ordered, but they were rarely punished. Over time, they became embedded in the operational culture of the army. From this internal logic emerged a dangerous assumption: the enemy would behave the same way. Japanese military intelligence and propaganda reinforced this idea. American forces were portrayed as brutal, rashly motivated, and vengeful. Leaflets and briefings warned soldiers that capture by the United States would result in torture or execution. Stories, some exaggerated, others entirely fabricated, circulated through units, hardening fear into certainty. This messaging intensified after December 1941. As Japan entered open war with the United States, racial caricatures became more extreme. Americans were described as morally weak, but violently cruel, capable of mercy only toward their own. The idea that an American soldier might treat a Japanese captive humanely was dismissed as naive fantasy. Meanwhile, the United States military was operating under a fundamentally different framework, bound by international conventions, most notably the Geneva Convention of 1929, which Japan had signed, but not fully ratified. American forces maintained formal policies governing the treatment of prisoners of war. These policies were not always followed perfectly in combat conditions, but they shaped doctrine, logistics, and camp administration. By 1942, as fighting spread across the Pacific, American commanders recognized that Japanese prisoners were rare. Many enemy soldiers fought to the death. Others took their own lives, when defeat became inevitable. This reinforced the perception among US troops that Japanese resistance was fanatical, but it also meant that when prisoners were captured, they became objects of intense scrutiny. Intelligence officers sought information, medical corpsmen treated wounds. Guards were instructed to prevent suicide. In many cases, food and shelter were provided immediately, not out of sentimentality, but because prisoners were valuable sources of operational insight. For the Japanese soldier entering captivity, none of this was known. He carried only what he had been taught. That mercy did not exist on the other side of the battlefield. That captivity was a prelude to suffering. That the enemy would reflect his own army's harshest instincts back at him. This collision between expectation and reality would define the POW experience for thousands of Japanese servicemen over the course of the war, and it would begin not in the camps themselves, but in the first hours after capture, when belief met contradiction under the watchful eyes of the enemy. Those first encounters, however, were shaped by forces far larger than individual soldiers, and to understand them fully, the broader strategic and cultural environment of the Pacific War must come into focus. The Pacific War was not only a clash of fleets and armies. It was a collision of assumptions about honor, race, endurance, and the meaning of surrender. From the American perspective, the war against Japan unfolded at immense geographic scale. Island chains stretched thousands of miles. Supply lines were fragile. Casualties mounted quickly. Yet from the earliest campaigns, Guadalcanal, New Guinea, the Gilbert's US commanders noticed a striking pattern. Japanese soldiers almost never surrendered. Units fought until ammunition was gone. Wounded men refused evacuation. Defensive positions were held long past tactical reason. This behavior was initially misunderstood. American officers attributed it to fanaticism or racial stubbornness. Only gradually did intelligence analysts begin to grasp the depth of ideological conditioning at work. Captured documents, diaries recovered from the dead, and interrogations of the few prisoners taken alive painted a clearer picture. Japanese soldiers were not merely discouraged from surrender. They were taught that capture erased their identity, that they would be listed as dead, that their families would be shamed. This belief produced battlefield consequences. American troops grew accustomed to fighting an enemy who did not retreat and did not capitulate. As a result, combat in the Pacific became intensely personal and often brutal. Close quarters fighting, cave clearances, and night engagements fostered fear and mutual dehumanization. Incidents of mistreatment of enemy dead did occur, particularly in the early stages of the war, further reinforcing Japanese propaganda narratives. Yet these battlefield realities coexisted with a formal system of prisoner handling that functioned away from the front lines. By 1942, the United States had established a network of POW camps stretching from Hawaii to the continental mainland. Camps in places like Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, Camp Forest in Tennessee, and Camp Tracy in California were designed to house Axis prisoners under standardized regulations. Food rations were based on US Army standards. Medical care was provided by military doctors. Discipline was enforced, but within codified limits. Japanese prisoners, when they arrived, were often shocked by the orderliness of these environments. Barbed wire was present, guards were armed, and escape attempts were punished, but daily life bore little resemblance to what they had been warned about. Meals were regular, living quarters, while basic, were clean. Prisoners were not beaten as a matter of routine. In some camps, they were assigned work details and paid small wages, as permitted under international law. This was not benevolence in the sentimental sense. It was bureaucracy. The American military believed that predictable systems produced control. Well-fed prisoners were less likely to revolt. Healthy prisoners could be interrogated. Order reduced risk. Still, to Japanese captives conditioned to expect cruelty, the effect was disorienting. Compounding this shock was the racial dynamic of captivity. Many Japanese soldiers had been told that Americans viewed them as subhuman, yet in camps, They encountered guards who followed rules, medics who treated injuries without discrimination, and officers who addressed them through interpreters rather than fists. Racism certainly existed, slurs were used, and trust was limited, but it was not the systematic brutality they had been prepared for. Over time, this gap between expectation and experience began to erode ideological certainty. Some prisoners became withdrawn, struggling with shame more than fear. Others became curious, asking questions about American life, industry, and culture. A few even cooperated willingly with interrogators, not because they had abandoned loyalty, but because the moral framework that defined loyalty had begun to crack. This transformation did not happen uniformly. Many prisoners remained hostile or silent. Some attempted suicide even in captivity, but the existence of an alternative reality, one in which the enemy did not behave as predicted, introduced doubt where none had been permitted before. That doubt would become central to the POW experience. It shaped behavior, morale, and survival. And it revealed itself most clearly when captivity was examined from multiple perspectives at once: human, tactical, cultural, and moral. Those perspectives, taken together, form the angles through which this story must now be seen. The human mind under capture. For the Japanese soldier, captivity was not merely a physical condition. It was a psychological rupture. From the moment of enlistment, identity had been fused with service. The emperor was not symbolic, he was sacred. To fight was to exist with purpose. To surrender was to erase that purpose entirely. When capture occurred, many soldiers reported a sensation not of fear, but of emptiness. They believed themselves already dead. This internal collapse manifested in different ways. Some prisoners refused food, convinced survival itself was a betrayal. Others avoided eye contact, speaking only when ordered. Suicide attempts were common in the first days of captivity, particularly immediately after medical treatment revived men who had expected to die of wounds. American guards were often instructed to monitor prisoners constantly during this period, not out of compassion alone, but because self-inflicted death deprived intelligence units of valuable information. Over time, the shock gave way to something more complex. The absence of immediate punishment confused emotional conditioning. When beatings did not follow mistakes, when food arrived regularly, when wounds were cleaned rather than ignored, the soldier's mental framework struggled to adjust. Shame did not disappear, but fear softened. Survival began to feel less like defiance and more like inertia continuing, because stopping required effort. This quiet psychological transition would define much of the POW experience, unfolding slowly behind barbed wire. Tactical value of the prisoner. From an American operational standpoint, Japanese prisoners were rare assets. Early in the war, intelligence on Japanese tactics, unit organization, and supply limitations was limited. Prisoners filled those gaps. Interrogation centers were established close to the front, staffed with linguists. Many of them Japanese Americans, trained by U.S. Army intelligence schools. These interrogations were methodical, structured, and largely non-violent. This approach surprised captives. Many expected coercion. Instead, they encountered questioning built on repetition, verification, and patience. Interrogators understood that Japanese soldiers were unlikely to volunteer information quickly. They focused instead on small details: unit insignia, terrain descriptions, supply shortages that could be cross-checked against other sources. The result was often cooperation, or not of betrayal, but of exhaustion. Prisoners who had been fed, treated, and rested found it difficult to reconcile silence with the reality around them. Some rationalized cooperation as meaningless, believing the war already lost. Others spoke simply because resistance no longer felt mandatory. This intelligence proved valuable. Information gleaned from prisoners influenced American understanding of Japanese defensive doctrine, particularly the use of caves, tunnels, and depth defense on islands later assaulted by U.S. forces. Thus, the humane treatment of prisoners was not incidental. It was a calculated component of battlefield advantage, technology, logistics, and daily life. Life in an American POW camp was governed by systems. Meals followed schedules, rations were standardized, medical checkups were routine. These details mattered. Japanese soldiers came from an army where supply shortages were common and medical care was often rudimentary. Many had experienced hunger long before capture. In camps, caloric intake frequently exceeded what they had known on the front lines. Technology reinforced this contrast. Running water, electricity, latrines designed for sanitation rather than expedience. These were not luxuries in the American system, they were infrastructure. But to prisoners, they represented an enemy with depth, resources, and industrial reach far beyond what propaganda had admitted. This realization carried quiet weight. It suggested not just military power, but endurance. An enemy capable of feeding prisoners consistently was an enemy capable of sustaining a long war. That realization would deepen as prisoners observed camp routines over weeks and months, drawing conclusions no briefing had prepared them for and setting the stage for further angles that cut even closer to ideology and command responsibility. Angle 4. Leadership and abandonment. For many Japanese prisoners, captivity brought with it a delayed reckoning not with the enemy, but with their own command structure. In the field, officers were revered, orders were absolute, responsibility flowed downward, never up. Yet in captivity, soldiers had time, often for the first time since enlistment, to reflect. They remembered being told that surrender was impossible, that death was preferable, that the army would never allow them to fall into enemy hands. But they had fallen, and no officer had come with them. In POW camps, rank still mattered among prisoners, but its meaning shifted. Senior non-commissioned officers struggled to maintain discipline over men who no longer believed they existed within the Army's moral universe. Some attempted to enforce pre-capture codes of conduct, including silence and resistance. Others withdrew, unwilling to assert authority in a place that no longer resembled the battlefield. This fragmentation revealed a painful truth. Once captured, Japanese soldiers were effectively erased by their own military system. They received no letters from home for long periods. They assumed their families had been informed of their deaths. This sense of abandonment deepened the psychological divide between ideology and lived experience. The enemy had not erased them. Their own institution had. Race, propaganda, and reality. Racial propaganda had been one of the most powerful tools shaping Japanese expectations of American behavior. Americans were portrayed as violent, undisciplined, and racially hateful. In reality, the camps presented a more complicated picture. Guards came from across the United States: farmers, factory workers, recent immigrants. Some harbored prejudice, others were simply indifferent. A few were quietly respectful. The presence of Japanese-American interpreters was particularly destabilizing. These men spoke fluent Japanese. They understood cultural cues. They wore American uniforms. For prisoners, this blurred the enemy's image. The war had been framed as a racial struggle. Yet here were men of Japanese descent serving the opposing side, enforcing rules calmly and professionally. This did not inspire loyalty, but it disrupted certainty. Prisoners could no longer reduce the enemy to caricature. Reality proved messier, and that complexity made hatred harder to sustain at full intensity over time. Moral contrast without sentiment. Perhaps the most unsettling angle was the quiet comparison prisoners could not avoid. Many had witnessed or participated in the mistreatment of enemy prisoners earlier in the war. In China, in Southeast Asia, on the march. These memories did not vanish in captivity. Instead, they returned with new context. American camps were not gentle. Discipline existed. Punishments were enforced. Freedom was gone. But systematic brutality was absent. This absence became its own presence, a silent contrast that required no accusation. Some prisoners responded with denial, others with guilt, a few with defensiveness, but for many, the comparison lingered, unresolved, shaping their internal narrative long after the war would end. These angles, human, tactical, logistical, leadership, racial, and moral, converged during a critical period, the first days and weeks of captivity, when expectation collapsed fully into reality. That convergence marked the true turning point of the experience. The turning point did not arrive with a single dramatic event. It unfolded quietly, over hours and days, in moments too ordinary to be anticipated and too powerful to ignore. For most Japanese prisoners, the first decisive rupture occurred within the initial 48 hours after capture. Wounds were treated, not selectively, not conditionally. Bullets were removed. Bandages were changed. Morphine was administered when pain became unbearable. Men who had expected to bleed out on the sand, or be left to die in a corner of a holding pen, instead found themselves lying on clean stretchers, under canvas shade, watched by medics whose task was preservation, not judgment. This was not mercy as they understood it. It was procedure. At temporary stockades near the front lines, prisoners were registered, names recorded, units identified, personal items catalogued. None of this fit the narrative they had been given. The act of being documented, of being acknowledged as an individual rather than an object, was profoundly destabilizing. Many prisoners remained convinced the real suffering would begin later, that kindness was a prelude, that once intelligence had been extracted, punishment would follow. This belief sustained emotional distance in the early days. They complied mechanically, waiting for the turn. But the turn did not come. Instead came routine. Food arrived on schedule. Guards rotated shifts. Roll calls were conducted without humiliation. When prisoners collapsed from exhaustion or illness, they were removed for treatment, not discipline. Suicide watches were established, not announced, but enforced quietly, with guards intervening when men attempted to starve themselves or reopen wounds. This was the moment when expectation finally failed, not dramatically, not all at once, but unmistakably. In camp after camp on Guam, on Saipan, in Hawaii, Japanese prisoners began to realize that captivity was not a temporary state leading to execution. It was a condition designed to continue. Days stretched forward without escalation. Weeks followed. And with that realization came something far more dangerous than fear. Time. Time to observe. Time to compare. Time to think. For soldiers trained to suppress reflection, time was corrosive. It eroded certainty. It allowed questions that had once been unthinkable to surface, not as rebellion, but as confusion. Why were they still alive? Why was food provided without demand? Why did the enemy seem uninterested in revenge? Interrogations, when they occurred, reinforced the contradiction. Prisoners were questioned politely, sometimes repeatedly, often indirectly. Silence was tolerated. Threats were absent. Sessions ended not with violence, but with dismissal back to barracks. This methodical restraint carried an unintended consequence. It granted prisoners a form of agency. They could choose not to speak and nothing happened. That realization alone dismantled years of conditioning built on fear of immediate reprisal. The climax of the POW experience, then, was not a riot or escape attempt. It was the quiet collapse of inevitability. The understanding that what had been promised was not what had arrived. And once that understanding took hold, it could not be reversed. That internal shift, subtle, irreversible, would deepen as captivity extended beyond weeks into months, forcing prisoners to confront not only their enemy, but themselves. As weeks turned into months, the turning point hardened into a new reality. Japanese prisoners began to understand that survival was not provisional. It was expected. In long-term camps, particularly those established in the continental United States, daily routines became predictable. Wake-up calls, work details, meals, recreation periods, medical inspections. The calendar advanced without incident. Seasons changed. For men who believed capture meant erasure, the persistence of ordinary time became psychologically overwhelming. This was where the deepest rupture occurred. Some prisoners resisted the passage of time itself. They refused to engage. They avoided work. They maintained silence not as defiance, but as self-preservation. To acknowledge the structure of camp life felt like acceptance, and acceptance felt like betrayal. Others adapted. They learned English phrases. They observed American customs. They asked about civilian life beyond the wire. A small number participated in camp activities, sports, reading, even classes organized by camp administrators to maintain order. None of this erased shame, but it dulled its edge. The most significant shift came when prisoners realized they were not being pressured to renounce loyalty or pledge allegiance. There were no forced declarations, no rituals of humiliation. The enemy seemed content to let captivity exist without ideological conquest. This restraint had consequences. Without external pressure, prisoners were left alone with their own beliefs. Some found those beliefs intact. Others found them hollow. The absence of coercion made reflection unavoidable. Reports from camp psychologists and intelligence officers noted this pattern. Prisoners who had initially been hostile became compliant. Those who had attempted suicide stabilized. Conversations among prisoners shifted from battlefield bravado to practical concerns: food quality, mail delivery, health. Mail, when it arrived, was another quiet shock. Letters from home confirmed survival. Families had not been informed of death. The world beyond the wire still acknowledged their existence. This contradicted everything they had been told. At this stage, captivity ceased to be a temporary ordeal. It became a parallel existence, bounded, controlled, but undeniably human. This realization did not liberate prisoners, it complicated them. They were alive in a war that insisted they should not be. That contradiction would follow them beyond the camps, shaping how the war ended for them, how they returned home, and how they would remember both enemy and empire in the years that followed. Those consequences, personal, national, and historical, would emerge fully only after the fighting stopped. When the war ended in August 1945, Japanese prisoners of war held by the United States did not celebrate. News of Japan's surrender arrived not as triumph or relief, but as confirmation of a long-suspected truth. The empire had fallen, the ideology that defined their service had failed, and survival, once considered disgraceful, was now unavoidable. For prisoners, the immediate aftermath unfolded in stages. Camps did not dissolve overnight. Procedures were followed, roll calls continued. Guards remained at their posts. The transition from enemy captive to defeated soldier was managed administratively, not ceremonially. Repatriation began gradually. Medical evaluations were conducted, records reviewed. Prisoners were transported by ship back across the Pacific, often in silence. Many had been away from Japan 4 years. They returned thinner, older, and burdened by a status that did not fit neatly into post-war society. In Japan, the reception was complex. Unlike returning combat units, former prisoners were not welcomed as heroes. Their survival carried stigma. Some concealed their power status entirely, claiming wounds or separation rather than capture. Families, long accustomed to viewing surrender as dishonor, struggled to reconcile ideology with reality. Yet the experiences prisoners carried could not be erased. They had seen the enemy's system from within. They had lived under guard without cruelty. They had eaten regularly while their country starved under blockade and bombardment. These observations did not translate easily into public discourse, but they shaped private understanding. American records from the period provide a stark contrast. Survival rates among Japanese POWs held by the United States exceeded 90%. Deaths were primarily due to pre-capture wounds or illness, not mistreatment. This stood in direct opposition to Japanese wartime propaganda and to the reality of Allied POW treatment under Japanese control. This disparity became a subject of post-war study. Allied investigators, war crimes tribunals, and historians would later examine the systemic differences between the two approaches to captivity. For former Japanese prisoners, However, the comparison was not academic, it was lived. Some became vocal critics of the military culture that had sent them into battle unprepared for defeat. Others remained silent, choosing reintegration over reflection. A few provided testimony to occupation authorities, offering insights into training practices, indoctrination, and battlefield realities that had been invisible during the war. The psychological aftermath was uneven. Shame persisted, so did confusion. The war had ended, but the internal conflict between belief and experience did not resolve cleanly. That unresolved tension would echo through post-war Japan, influencing how memory, responsibility, and humanity were negotiated in the decades that followed. Beyond individual experience, the broader consequences of captivity shaped post-war understanding of both militaries and human resilience. Statistical records from the US Army show that approximately 35,000 Japanese soldiers were held in American camps between 1942 and 1945. Mortality was remarkably low compared to Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners in the Pacific, where estimates suggest that between 20 and 30% of captured personnel died due to mistreatment, disease, and malnutrition. The stark contrast underscored not only differing logistical capacities, but fundamentally divergent philosophies of warfare. The contrast was evident in testimonies collected during post-war interviews. Prisoners recalled surprise at the regularity of meals, the provision of medical care, and the relative absence of physical abuse. One former infantryman described his first months at a Hawaiian camp as a life I did not believe possible, noting that guards treated us like humans, not animals. Accounts like these circulated among other returnees, gradually reshaping the narrative of enemy conduct in Japan, even if public shame made acknowledgement difficult. Allied leadership also reflected on these outcomes. Senior officers emphasized that humane treatment was not only ethically mandated, but strategically effective. Prisoners who were alive, healthy, and compliant provided intelligence and required fewer resources for control. Discipline maintained through systems, rather than brutality, reduced incidents of escape, rebellion, and internal violence. The implications extended beyond immediate military concerns. Captivity exposed Japanese soldiers to a society operating on predictable rules and infrastructure, fostering recognition, sometimes conscious, sometimes subconscious, that their own army's ideology had limitations. Time in POW camps, therefore, functioned as both survival mechanism and silent education, reshaping perspectives even in those most resistant to reflection. Repatriation, however, was never purely restorative. Former prisoners confronted war-ravaged homes, societal expectations of honor, and the weight of collective defeat. Families struggled to reconcile traditional notions of loyalty and shame with the lived reality of their son's survival. For many, the experience created a lasting duality, pride in enduring the battlefield, combined with persistent stigma for having been captured. In aggregate, these experiences revealed enduring truths about human behavior under extreme conditions. Captivity was not solely a punishment. It was a space where expectation collided with reality, belief clashed with evidence, and ideology met circumstance. The lessons extended beyond individual soldiers, influencing post-war scholarship, military doctrine, and, ultimately, historical understanding of the Pacific conflict. The war had ended, but the impact of those first bewildering days of capture, the subtle turning point, reverberated across decades, reshaping memory, morale, and meaning. In the end, the story of Japanese prisoners held by the United States is not merely about war. It is about expectation, perception, and the human capacity to confront the unfamiliar. Soldiers trained to anticipate brutality found order instead. Men indoctrinated to believe surrender meant obliteration discovered survival. Ideology clashed with lived reality, producing confusion, adaptation, and, sometimes, silent acknowledgement of a shared humanity. The contrast between Japanese assumptions An American practice illuminates deeper truths about warfare. Discipline, honor, and obedience shaped one army. Systems, procedure, and ethical codes shaped another. One relied on fear to enforce control. The other relied on predictability, transparency, and infrastructure. The results observable in survival rates, psychological outcomes, and post-war testimony demonstrate that treatment of captives is never a peripheral concern. It is central to both moral and strategic calculations in conflict. Yet beyond metrics and doctrine lies the human element. Captivity revealed the fragility of rigid belief. It exposed the ways in which fear, indoctrination, and rumor can dominate thought until contradicted by experience. For prisoners, recognition of this dissonance often arrives slowly, leaving a residue of guilt, shame, or introspection that persisted long after repatriation. And for history, the lessons are enduring. Understanding the lived reality of prisoners challenges assumptions about cruelty, morality, and expectation in war. It shows that humanity can persist even amid destruction, that systems can enforce order without extinguishing dignity, and that ideology, no matter how powerful, cannot fully dictate lived experience. In the silence of a camp, in the measured delivery of meals, in the quiet vigilance of guards, a soldier learns something the battlefield could not teach: that survival and honor need not be mutually exclusive, and that the enemy too could reflect a form of discipline, bound not by vengeance, but by law and reason. From fear to reflection, from expectation to reality, captivity became more than an ordeal. It became a mirror, showing not just what war demanded, but what humanity could endure. And in that mirror, countless lives were irrevocably changed, forever carrying the lessons of a world they had been trained to hate, but ultimately had been forced to understand.